hope you're doing well. My name is Anahita Sen, and I'm a co-facilitator of the M&A Stories YouTube podcast, which is brought to you by Fifth Grown Business Insights. Welcome to Season 3. The theme of this season is culture and its impact on M&A integration. Culture is one of the biggest challenges that face an M&A integration, and this challenge couldn't get any bigger as more companies are pursuing M&A based on people and culture. That is why it is important to understand, internalize, respect, and develop a clear plan of action on how to handle culture in M&A. In this season, we will be interviewing industry leaders from across the globe to hear their stories on how they address culture in an M&A integration. So here we go with today's episode.
Hi there, welcome to another episode of M&A Stories. Today, our guest is a well-renowned, internationally traveled person in the space of culture, which is the theme, by the way, of this season. So I would like to welcome Alain Bridoux, who's currently based in France, but Alain has had chance of traveling around the world. He spent quite some time in China. He's worked with big companies and also he's now a freelancer, consultant, and a visiting professor in France. So ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Alain Bridoux. Alain, why don't we start with an introduction?
Well, thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure for me. As you said, I've worked all my life, nearly 43 years, in big multinational companies, and I lived in different countries, starting with Madagascar, then England, Netherlands, Belgium, and eventually China. This has been a big experience for me. And when I semi-retired, I decided to teach in some business schools in France. And this is what is today my main occupation, teaching in business schools and doing a bit of consultancy on different matters, including cross-cultural management.
Brilliant. And you've also been involved with some mergers and acquisitions and large-scale business transformation as well in the past, right?
Yes, this is right. My main job has been finance director for regions, but this job included in some cases responsibility for picking up possible acquisitions for my company. This happened for big US multinational when I had responsibility for finance for Western Europe. And in that capacity, I had the chance to make about 20 acquisitions and be involved in 40 acquisition deals. That was in the late 90s. Eventually, I had also opportunities to get involved and go to the process of acquisitions for other multinationals. This was my main experience in acquisitions, which took place in Central Europe, France, England, Germany, Netherlands, and Belgium.
Excellent. And I think that covers quite a wide area of countries. Even within Europe, people don't realize how different cultures are between countries. Since the theme of our season this time is culture, let's start with why do you think culture is such an important element of mergers and acquisitions?
Well, there is, in my experience, there is always a culture clash between the acquiring company and the sellers. By experience, most of the acquisitions I was involved in were made from the acquiring company side. And at the time, my employer was big US multinationals. In the late 90s, beginning of 2000, the US culture was pretty much dominant. And the big thing was culture was left aside. And the thinking of the parent company was pretty much alignment. Alignment was the magic word, which for somebody like me, a European, was a bit of a shortcut. So as responsible for some European acquisitions, I had the difficult task and sometimes the impossible task to explain HQ that, yeah, alignment is good, but there might be other things which need to be tackled.
Right. And why do you think culture is such a big challenge? Because literally, it seems like companies don't think about culture up front. And then when things happen, they're like, oh my God, we should have thought about this. So why do you think culture is such a big challenge for organizations?
I think that culture comes in two flavors in a way. First, you have the national culture, and two, you have the company culture. The two obviously are somewhat intertwined, but from a US standpoint, I think that my experience is that my principals only believed in company culture and thought that national cultures had to be left aside and, if possible, aligned with the culture of the parent company, which was mainly US. This is something which worked somewhat until the beginning of the years 2000, but after that, most people realized that alignment was not the only possibility, and in fact, was leading to all sorts of blunders.
That's actually a great point. Two different ways of looking at culture. You have the geography culture, or country culture, and then you have um, company culture or business culture. Um, how about sharing some examples?
Well, maybe we can start with conversations, discussions, negotiations. Based on my experience, there are three types of conversations. And obviously, when you want to acquire a company, you need to have some conversations and some negotiations. My experience is that conversations can be of three types. And if you don't know these three types, you come across a near impossibility to communicate. The typical French way, Southern Europe way, is the so-called overlapping type of conversation. So as a French person talking to another French person, or talking to a Spaniard, or talking to a Greek, or to a Portuguese, it's very acceptable that if you talk, suddenly, to show my interest in what you are saying, I interrupt you in the middle of your sentence, wave my hands, and say something to prove that I'm awake, interested, and engaged in the conversation. This is what really should happen in good French type conversations. Unfortunately, this doesn't work when you deal with Dutch people, even less German people, because the normal, and even American people, because what you are supposed to do in these type of conversations is to wait politely until such a time that the other person is finished. And in fact, if you don't wait until the German person is finished, you cannot say anything intelligent because the most important word is right at the end of the sentence in German. Therefore, it leads to no communication, and whatever good you have to sell, whatever good case you have, there is no deal.
Right.
This is even worse in Asian type of conversations, which are punctuated and by which you need to show respect to the person who has talked by waiting a split second before you start again to talk. So obviously you can imagine what happens in the worst case, which would be a French person interrupting a Chinese person. Well, there is not even a start of a discussion. It's
Right.
the end of it. So I think that the three types of conversations are pretty much cultural, and you need to know that they exist. If
Right.
you can explain your partner, your business partner, that that's the way you do, but if there is no warning signal, then there is no possibility of a deal or any type of negotiation. I think that's really the start.
Right. So let me extend on that thought process. Okay. In mergers and acquisitions, it's not a cheap process. You have to engage bankers, investment bankers, lawyers, other external consultants to help you. identify and go through the process in M&A. And it's not an unknown thing that there's a difference of culture between, let's say, Western Europe and China or Asia. In spite of that, we still find organizations struggle when they do their M&A. It's not that they didn't have money. So what goes wrong? Why do people are not able to navigate through this cultural challenge that people recognize, but somehow they can't navigate through it?
I think this comes mainly from what I've described at the beginning, which is the thought in the US that the rest of the world would be so much better and could improve if they were like us. This is going back to this question of alignment.
Right.
Alignment, I think, has worked for some time, but today it has proved totally insufficient. It doesn't show up at the beginning of the discussions in an acquisition because typically big US companies would engage a lot of consultants who are by training international, which have a lot of diversity among their members, and they are capable to bridge the gap between the culture of the acquiring company and the sellers. But once the deal is done, once the acquiring company is in charge, then culture should be handled in a very delicate way. And the worst obviously is to pretend that there is no gap and go back to this alignment idea, which is failing miserably now in most cases.
Right. And that's a very interesting point, because literally in the pre-deal stage, if cultural mismatch is found, people can walk out. But once the deal is done, and then the cultural differences start coming up, it becomes very difficult for organizations. I mean, they obviously can't walk out, right? What are some of the things that organizations end up doing when these cultural differences come up in the post-integration scenario?
Well, that's the point. I think the due diligence part, based on my experience, is pretty well done by big multinationals. They engage all sorts of consultants, including some HR consultants, and they get a pretty good view of what can be seen from the outside to make a decision and decide to go ahead with the deal or not. But they don't really know about the culture of the sellers, excepted if you get some subtle messages, for example, when visiting the company to be acquired. I have an example, which was a French company acquiring a company in England. And this was in the late 80s, so it's already a long time ago. But I remember we had the acquisition team walking into the premises of the company to be acquired. And on the desk of some employees, there were some typical British messages implying that they were very unhappy about changing hands. Well, clearly, this type of message has to be taken very seriously, because if the staff of the company that you want to acquire doesn't want to change hands or is afraid of the new owners, then it's not going to be easy. You need to do something, and you need to have a plan.
Right. The example that you shared is not unique necessarily. It's pretty much there in a large number of acquisitions, that there is this entire workforce being unhappy, right?
I think the reason is very simple. The sellers are not immediately trying to show to the buyers that there is a big gap. In fact, it is in their interest to hide that gap and even pretend it doesn't exist. This goes back to a Latin saying, which applies very much to acquisitions, in my opinion. It's caveat emptor, which means the buyer should be very careful.
Mm-hmm.
It's true that the seller has to be careful too, but obviously the seller knows what he's selling and the buyer doesn't really know what he's going to get. And in some cases, like culture, it is pretty much in the interest of the seller to say that there is no gap, that all things are rosy and so on.
Right. Now, you've been involved in this space for many, many years. What would you cite as examples where cultural integration really worked well? And what were some of the worst ones?
I have an example of a small company, a Canadian group acquired in France. And they had already some operations. I was in charge of finance and acquisitions for France and Western Europe. It was acquiring a small competitor on the French Riviera.
Mm-hmm.
So it was very small, family business, 20, 25 people. In France at the time, our operations had like 500 people. So it was the size of medium size business in France. And we had discussion with the owner, who was apparently a very gentle person, very devoted to the company, very well looking after his staff. Now, we made the deal. I could not smell any big culture difference or anything difficult about that small acquisition. But the day after the acquisition, we went down to explain to the staff what was going to happen and blah, blah, blah. And then suddenly we saw the owner, the seller, coming to his new Ferrari, his new shoes, his new suit, and he was starting to explain to the staff, oh, you see, these big Canadian people, they have money. You should ask for a raise. And we thought, well, it's really, this is a bit ridiculous. He had told us that he had frozen the salaries, but that there was not any difficulty with the staff. And he's coming the first day after the acquisition to explain his former staff with his big Ferrari that they should ask for an increase. So obviously we were very upset.
Right.
We kicked him out. And in the end, it worked nicely for us because the staff said, oh, this is disgusting. He didn't give us any salary raise for 14 months. He told us that all things would be okay. And suddenly we have a new owner and the former boss comes and says, oh, you should ask for a raise. So it worked well in the end, but the approach was absolutely disgusting, obviously.
Right, right. Now, culture is no longer an area where people just go blindly and try to handle it. You know, there has been a considerable amount of work that has taken place over the last couple of decades, at least.
Mm-hmm.
With some of these knowledge, how should one go about designing a cultural integration plan?
I think that's there's no one size fits all.
Sure.
In that case, but based on my experience, first thing is not to leave totally to the acquisition team the responsibility to make the integration plan from a cultural standpoint. I think clearly there should be a team put together that should include some people, some champions in the acquired company, because you need to get the voice of the acquired employees. You need obviously to get the plan prepared by the new management. And then you get also some representation of the acquisition team. And I think this should be different teams. One big mistake which is made sometimes, in fact, I've seen it happening very often, is to mix up or to have the same people doing the due diligence, doing the pre-acquisition work, and be in charge of the acquired company.
Mm-hmm.
The main reason is, well, if the people of the due diligence team are the same, they are never going to turn down an acquisition project because it's their future jobs.
Right.
So that's rule number one.
Mm-hmm.
Rule number two is, yes, it's good to retain the former owners in some capacity, but it's totally and absolutely wrong to believe that you can retain the previous owner in a managing capacity. They should be consultants, they could be retained for some time, but typically you cannot retain them and they cannot do a good job for the acquiring company.
Right. These are two great call outs. I've seen that go wrong so many times, especially because imagine it's like a person who is the owner, who's the CEO of a company, all of a sudden has his company ownership moved to somebody else. Now, the somebody else would like to drive it as per their own strategic objectives. And the CEO feels, hey, this is my company. I should be able to run it the way I've run it in the past. And that's not necessarily aligned to the strategic objective of the acquiring company. So great call out, great call out. Now, for our listeners, why don't we walk through this cultural integration process? Why don't we unpack what happens when? So let's start. What's the starting point? When should people talk about culture the first time?
Well, I think that ideally there should be some cultural sides covered during the due diligence process. But it's not going to be resolved, or it's a delicate point because culture could be a no game, and it could be a breaking point in some cases. And if you make the deal, then you have got a company and you might find it nearly impossible to manage.
Right.
This has been my experience in the last job I had, and I was expecting it somewhat, but I went in a joint venture with a former state-owned company in China, and despite the fact that we knew that the culture shock would be big, what we found afterwards was just impossible to manage.
Right.
So in a way, I think that culture could be a deal breaker. If it is a deal breaker, the due diligence team should have the strength and the ability to say it is a deal breaker. But by experience, what I've seen is that often, if not always, it's seen as an important or a consideration, but that you will have to deal with only after making the deal.
Right. Right. And in fact, what we've also observed is, I think a great starting point is during the due diligence stage. Obviously, I always say people should also start looking at it really at a strategy setting level and then kind of go into the due diligence. One of the challenges or one of the constant things that I look at, one of the areas that I look at when it comes to cultural integration is people interact with the buyers, as in the leadership team, and then they form opinion. And on the basis of the opinion, they make a cultural decision, right? So it's the personality interpretation that converts into a cultural decision. Now, how good or bad is that?
Well, as you said, it takes place during the due diligence phase, but typically, on the seller side, the ones who have negotiated will be gone.
Right.
And therefore, the type of input they are going to give you is either by interest or by lack of knowledge, incomplete.
Right. Right. And that's why what would you advise that when companies are conducting due diligence, that they not only look at the personality of some of these people in senior positions, some of them will leave, some of them will kind of stay on, but what else should they be looking for?
I think they should probably get information from third parties like suppliers and customers. It's most of the time it is impossible to have interviews with key people who will stay after the acquisition. So it's a very difficult task. Reputation, commercial reputation, number of litigations, uh, turnover of staff, these are indicators. But I think that in the end, you only find out about the culture of the company afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the big difficulty.
Right.
And I'm talking obviously for small acquisitions. If you go back to the merger between P&G and Gillette, for example,
Mm-hmm.
well, the two partners knew about the culture of the other. They were US companies. So culture was only a problem at the level of company culture.
Sure. Sure. Absolutely. And in my experience as well, when it comes to big mergers or large companies involved, and I don't want to go into the Daimler Chrysler example, but I'm just saying in general, larger companies, there is a lot more thoughts that get in. There is a lot more structure that gets put in, a lot more rigor that gets put in. Unfortunately, the same does not get extended to smaller companies, smaller acquisitions, right? Smaller acquisitions, it is believed, just give it to a couple of people, let them figure out how the integration is going to take place. Culture is almost an afterthought in many of these cases, right? Now, you have been a big promoter of including culture in mergers and acquisitions, especially starting from the due diligence all the way to post-merger integration. Why do you think it is so important to include culture, and what are the benefits people or organizations can expect when they do cultural integration properly?
I think it certainly makes the smooth running of the company, of the acquired company, a lot easier.
Mm-hmm.
And in that case, the difficulty is sometimes not only coming from the acquired company. Most of the difficulty I found in my career comes from the
Acquiring
acquiring
company.
company from HQ.
Yes.
And HQ, yeah, let's face it, in US companies, when you talk about culture, you have to talk to people who sometimes have never put a foot in the country where the acquisition is taking place.
Mm-hmm.
If you try to talk to the HR people,
Yeah.
well, then they are totally disconnected.
Right.
So conveying the message is not easy.
Right.
And sometimes it's, well, it doesn't work.
Right.
Ideally, I think when you cannot convey a message to HQ, the best recipe I found in my career is to hire a consultant with a
Mm-hmm.
good reputation who will convey your message to the
To the
parent
HQ.
company.
Right.
And they will pay for it, so they will believe in it.
Right. Right. And when companies do the cultural integration well, what benefits do they get out of it?
Well, I think it's a cross-fertilization,
Mm-hmm.
and we know now better than in the 90s that diverse organizations are more innovative and pay more attention to customer satisfaction. So innovation and customer satisfaction, these are the two beneficiaries of a good cultural integration, which in fact includes not only the staff of the acquired company, but its entire ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that would include your suppliers,
That's right.
customers,
That's
strategic
right. That's
partners.
right.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think it goes both ways. It's not just the acquired company, it's also the acquiring company. And this is where a lot of companies make mistakes saying, hey, I'm acquiring another company, and therefore the only assessment I'm going to do is of the target company or the company that's being acquired, and not necessarily on yourself. And that's where a large gaps remain. So so this is something which is really valuable. With respect to cultural integration, what we see now is there is a lot more companies that are using digital transformation. There are a lot more companies that are service oriented or service based, strong on intellectual property or knowledge centric, people centric. How do you think culture is going to unfold when it comes to acquisition of these kind of companies in the future?
Well, I think that it's a question also of national cultures.
Mm-hmm.
And my experience on that is that Scandinavian companies are a lot more successful, but they have also their downsides. I
Mm-hmm.
think they are very successful in the fact that they recognize the differences of local cultures.
Right.
Their downside can be that they are a little shy
Mm-hmm.
about disrupting and that they believe in continuing what was in place rather than transforming the acquisition.
Right. Right.
And that's exactly the opposite of what I've seen for US companies,
Right.
which believe that as long as they align the acquired company on what is done in HQ, it's going to be fine. And all the rest is just sandbagging.
Right. This has been a great session so far. Just a couple of questions I have that I want to ask you before we wrap up the show. And these questions are a bit more like rapid fire. So, what is the most disdainful an episode, an event that happened that you really hated it with respect to cultures connected to M&A integration?
Well, I think this the example I gave you earlier, which turned out well for us, was the case of this family owner
Mm-hmm.
who came the day after acquisition telling his former staff, oh, you should get a salary increase because you had sold. Yeah, this was really a bad experience. I think we had also a case of purchasing a distributor in Belgium. And this is one of my worst experience personally, because I had recommended the purchase of the company. It was not a big company. It was like 30 people, 40 people uh, was doing distribution of our products in Belgium. There was some sort of charismatic owner, and we thought that he would help us in the future without keeping a managing director position.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the point was that he was a bit of a difficult personality,
Mm-hmm.
and we found out
Sure.
afterwards because he could be charming on the discussions. And after having purchased his business for something like 10 or 20 million dollars at the time, 1 year later, we
Mm-hmm.
were very glad to resell it to him for $1.
Right. Right.
So this was not a big career advancement for me, I have to say.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
And the reason was we had neglected the personality of the owner. We had neglected the fact that in Belgium, some of the deals are pretty much based on persons,
Mm-hmm.
persons to person, personality.
Yep.
And with the former owner gone or who was threatening to go, well, there was no business at all.
Right. Right. Yep. Very true. Very true. What sort of tools and templates or methodology would you recommend um, to people who want to run cultural integration?
I think I would probably start now by asking the sellers and also the staff what they see as the main values of the company.
Okay.
I think values, very often they are proclaimed, but if you can match what has been proclaimed and what has been done, then you have a good idea of what you are going to find. And this obviously involves the third parties like customers and suppliers.
Right.
So a company which has a reputation of squeezing out their suppliers, like Valeo in France was at some point in time, well, you know what you are going to find. You are going to find people who are greedy and totally self-centered. And then this can be a deal breaker.
Right. Makes sense. Turning the gear here and moving to literally last two questions. Some favorite business books of yours?
Yes. Well, I've taken with me a few of these books. This one was a very famous book in the 1990s. I think this guy did very well. In fact, he was extremely smart because he recycled himself in the consultancy and HR after marrying a very famous
Susie Welch.
I think he did a pretty good job.
So Alain, because this is also going to be on a podcast, so if you could just narrate the name of the book and the author.
Yes.
For people who are just listening in.
Regarding cultures, I think you have in Netherlands two very famous authors who have produced books which are still the basis of what should be done or known by people making acquisitions. One is Geert Hofstede with Cultures and Organizations. This is a basic book. It's getting a bit old. I think he's dead now, but his son or his family is still having a consultancy.
And that's right.
That's still working pretty well.
Yeah.
The other one is Frans Trompenaars with Riding the Waves of Culture, also a Dutch guy who has worked for Shell. These are two excellent books. I find them a bit outdated now. And there are new things based on the more recent research. One is a book from Erin Meyer, The Culture Map, and she's teaching at INSEAD in France, but she's American, and she has really integrated the big differences between cultures in terms of company integration. That's an excellent book.
Yes.
Regarding the way to tailor organizations, I like one small book which has been written by Frédéric Laloux from Belgium, and which is called Reinventing Organizations.
Right.
So these would be. There is also another one from another American author, Mr. Nisbet, The Culture Map, which I find very good because it explores also the differences between Asia and the Western world.
Right. And the first book that Alain had shared is by Jack Welch, and I think it's called The Winning, if I remember correctly. Yes. So for viewers and listeners, we will put the link of these books in the show notes so that you can look them up and buy them or read them. I've read quite a few of those. I think most of those. Brilliant, absolute brilliant reading material. So this is good stuff. Now, I know some people would like to get in touch with you, especially with your background on organization culture and geography culture, regional culture. What's the best way they can reach out to you?
They can certainly reach me through email, and you have got my personal email. But I think we can probably do it through your organization, and it will be up to you to transmit.
Sure.
Why don't we do that? It's probably easier for you and also for me.
Yep, brilliant. And one last piece of advice or any final words before we wrap up the show today?
Well, I think that my Latin quote, caveat emptor, is still very right. And in fact, it's also true on a personal basis. When you have a one-off transaction, like an acquisition, the buyer needs to be especially careful.
Mm-hmm.
This is true at all levels of the acquisition, and certainly regarding culture. People now are, some people are capable to hide very well their feelings, their ways of doing things. In fact, based on research, I've seen that about 1/3 of CEOs are sociopaths.
Right.
And this says something about the level of caution you have to apply when you deal with people at the top who might be selling one of their businesses.
Right. Right. Oh, well, the future does not look that bright because, I'm a CEO as well, but we run a small company, I guess. But we should not be looking at making it a big company that we become a sociopath, right?
Well,
So,
it's a permanent struggle, to be sure, and you have to test yourself from time to time.
absolutely. Absolutely. This has been brilliant. Thank you so much, Alain. I got to learn a lot as usual. Whenever I have conversation with you, there's so much that I get to learn, and I'm sure our viewers and listeners would do the same. There's a lot of value to be gained from this conversation. So I'd like to thank you again, Alain. It was really nice having you as our guest tonight.
Thank you for having me, Anirvan, and it has been a pleasure for me also.
I hope you guys enjoyed the show today. This show was sponsored by Fifth Chrome, a business strategy advisor in a training company specializing in M&A, post-merger integration, and business strategy.
Did you like today's content? If yes, then don't forget to hit the like button. If you heard something interesting, then don't forget to share it with your network and friends. And last but not least, please support us on this journey to spread awareness on topics related to M&A and integration by subscribing to our channel. That's all for now. Stay healthy and see you next time.
And if you like this episode, I'm sure you'll also like our latest new tool. It is a quick assessment scorecard to assess the robustness of your M&A integration design. It just takes less than 5 minutes to answer. It is for free and you can get instantaneous recommendation. So visit maintegrationplan.scoreup.com and find out for yourself.